to this video where I will go through some simple tips for weaving a wall hanging. You can do these on any loom. I've got a 16 shaft Harris table loom. I'll show you how I do the edges of my wall hangings and how I finish the ends. And I'll show you some different techniques on how I create my unique wall hangings. Tip number 1. Leaving spaces in your weft to create gaps in your design. So as an example of this technique, I'm just going to weave a pattern and then I'm going to create some gaps in my weft. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do one row of plain weave. So I'm just going to take a small stick and weave it into what I've done so far. And then just continue weaving after you've done that. So I'm just going to put another stick in here. So now I'm just going to take out these sticks. So now you have the gaps in your warp, and I'm just going to seal my edges with some fray stop glue. So that was tip number 1, and now I'm going to do my next tip, which is going to be showing you how I finish the edges of my wall hangings. So now I'm going to start a new wall hanging. So I'll show you what I do to finish the bottom hem, and then at the end I'll show you how I finish the top. I'll be making a wall hanging similar to this one. So I'm going to start with just a couple of plain weave threads. And I'm just going to weave a couple of centimetres up of my design. So now that I've made a start on my wall hanging, I'm going to think about what I should do with this bottom edge. So like I've done with this wall hanging, I could quickly just glue the edge once it's off the loom, just by using some fray stop glue. Or you could do a hem stitch at the end like I've done with this scarf, so that you don't have to use any glue. So I'm going to do this technique for this wall hanging to show you how it looks. So what you'll need is the yarn similar to the yarn you're using. I'm going to use the same wool that's on my weave, or you could use something different if you want the hem stitch to be visible. And then you'll need an embroidery needle if your yarn is thick, so that that's easy to thread through. And then I'm going to cut a length of yarn that's about 4 times the width of my warp, just so that I know that I definitely will have enough to hem stitch it. So the start of my wool hanging is the start of the red wool. So I'm just going to start my hem stitch by tying a knot onto the end of my weave. And then hem stitching is all about grouping your warp yarns together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have groups of 4 warp yarns. So I'm going to be going across 4 warp yarns and over 2 weft yarns. So I'm just counting along 4 warp threads, and I'm going to go underneath them, and I'm going up 2 weft threads, and I'm going to come out there. So that's from going underneath the fabric, coming out there, and then I'll go underneath those warp threads that I just went around. I'll go in here and come out there this time, and I'll just create a loop by going inside this loop here, and just pull that tight, but be careful not to break your wool. So that's grouped those ends of yarn together and created a knot. You could group together more than that, create big groups of yarn, and it will be quicker to hem stitch, but I want to do small groups. So now you can do the same thing again. So you've got to go back the way that you just came out, so back there, and you're going to put your needle to the back of the cloth. So my needle is behind, and then I'm going to count 4 warp threads across and 2 weft threads up, and I'm going to come out there, and then I'm going to go back through there and then across the 4 warp threads, come out here, and then that will pull and create a loop again. And then again, just go through back to the back of the fabric, across 4 and up 2, back through this hole, across 4 and out here, and just make sure that your yarn goes through the loop so that it ties in a knot. So I'm just going to do my final group at the end, going in there, coming out right at the edge. I'm just going to tie a knot right in the end as well, just to make it extra secure. So there's my hemmed edge. Now I'm going to carry on weaving my pattern. Tip number 3. For my wall hangings, I like to fray the edges. So some of them I've kept looped over, but then for these sections I've cut them. It just keeps it all really neat and creates a nice textured edge. So I'll show you how I've done that. So the red yarn is the beginning of my wall hanging. So for the first 3 rows I've just made sure that they're looped over the edges, just to keep all the ends looped over. And then for the rest I'm going to start fraying the edges. So there's 2 options when you do this. Either you can weave and as you go just pull your weft so that you leave a little bit left over hanging off the edge. Or if you want a guide to make sure that each loop is definitely going to be the same length, you can attach a piece of string. So you can just tie a piece of string anywhere to the back of your loom. Pass it through. And then thread it through your reed wherever you'd like it to go. And then you can attach it to the front. And then you can do the same on this side, so that when you weave you can go under the string and then back over it. And you create loops which you can cut once you've taken it off the loom. So having my string there would create quite big loops if you wanted a big frayed edge. I just want a small edge on mine, and I'm not going to use the string for mine, as I'll just pull it with my finger and then at the end I'll trim it. You might want to catch the edges from time to time so that it's all held together. So now I've woven most of my wall hanging. You can see how the edges are looking, just all looped round, and then some I've left woven normally, so you've got a different look. And then you'll trim the edges once it's off the loom. My next tip in making a really creative wall hanging is to paint your warp or your weft, because you can do some really interesting mark making just on the surface of your warp. And then you can also weave in painted yarn to create some stripe patterns on your weave. So on my wall hangings, this one just has some hemp paper yarn that I've painted black in sections. And then also I like to paint my warp. So this one I painted it while it was on my warping frame. Sometimes I paint it directly as I go and then let it dry and then weave it. This is my painted yarn that I'm going to add into my wall hanging. And I just painted it by wrapping it around a stick, then painting on the black. And this is the yarn that I used. It's from Uppingham Yarns in the UK. And it is paper yarn made from Manila hemp. So the dye that I've got, paint my weft and my warp, this is the one that I've used, and it's just my own kind of blend of natural dyes. So I just boiled up a few different natural dyes, some indigo, some kind of yellow plant dyes, and mixed with some iron that makes it turn black. And then I reduced it down so that it was thick like paint consistency. And I get my natural dyes from a company called Wild Colours. But you could use synthetic dyes or paint. Also, if you wanted to know what yarns I'm using in this weave, I've got my own naturally dyed wool that I dye myself. This is a chunkier version of it, a double knit yarn. It's on my website if you wanted to get some of the same yarn. I'm also going to add in a bit of this copper gold yarn. This is a viscose. And I've also got a hemp warp. And I'll put a discount code on the screen now for my online shop. So here's all the painted yarn that I've added into my weave. And you can see my painted warp as well. I just painted that on with a brush so you can see all of the brush strokes. If you've made it this far into the video, leave a comment down below on what kind of loom you've got or are planning on getting. Then I can do some more tutorials on 4 shaft or 8 shaft or rigid heddle looms. Okay, so now that I've finished my wall hanging, I'm going to put a wooden dowel in it so that I can hang it. So like this one here, it's just got a wooden dowel woven through it. So I'm just going to do that. So this is tip number 5, hanging your wall hanging with a dowel or a stick or something. So I've got loads of wooden dowels or steel rods in this basket that I use. So I'm going to use this wooden dowel, but you could use a bigger one or maybe a metal one. Or you could use a shuttle, which would look cool woven into your wall hanging. Or maybe a thin one to make little mini wall hangings. Or you could collect a piece of driftwood or a stick or something. I'm just going to wind this on a bit. And I'll just saw off the end. So that's my dowel woven into place, and now I'll just continue weaving for a little bit. Now I'll just add in one line of the red yarn. And that's it finished. So now that I've finished my wall hanging, I'll show you the other method of finishing my edges. So I'm just going to use some fray stop glue and just place it on the last thread of yarn. Okay, and I'll just let that dry, then I'll cut it off the loom. The wall hanging's now off the loom, and I'll just finish up the edges, trimming them off. Okay, so that's all of the edges now trimmed. So now all I'm going to do next is tie on a bit of yarn onto the wooden dowel so that it's able to hang up. This is some more painted yarn that I'm just going to use. Now I'm just going to use the edge of the table to get a nice clean line on the end. Now that it's finished, you can see the hem stitch properly. And that's just grouped the ends of the yarn together and looks really neat at the bottom. Thanks for watching, that's the end of this video. If you'd like to look at my wall hangings, they're on my shop now. I'll leave a link in the description below. And if you've got any questions, leave a comment below. Also, I'm going to start doing recommendations at the end of each video. So for this video, I'm going to recommend to you this book on weaving. It's called Weaving Contemporary Makers on the Loom. And it's got really good insight into other weavers and makers in here if you want some inspiration. It's a really nice book and I think it's a great one to have.